people trickle in, I'm going to do a few preliminaries here. I'd like to welcome everyone to this second event in the Northwest Science Writers Association series on decolonizing science communication. I'm Wade Gibbs, the current president of NSWA, and we're glad that you've chosen to spend some of your evening with us. If you weren't able to attend our earlier event in this series in July, I encourage you to watch the recorded video of the discussion, which we've posted on our website, which is nwscience.org. Tonight's event is also being recorded and will be available on our website by next week. So if you know somebody who wanted to be here but couldn't make it, point them towards that. I'd like to start off by acknowledging on behalf of Northwest Science Writers Association, with respect and gratitude, that our members across the Pacific Northwest live on territories that have been the homelands of Native peoples for thousands of years. I'm speaking to you now from Kirkland, Washington, which is within the homelands of the Duwamish, Stillaguamish, and Coast Salish peoples. I encourage you all to learn about the history of Native ownership of the lands that you live and work on. And two useful resources for this are native-land.ca and nativegov.org. For those who are not already NSWA members, I'll quickly mention that our association supports science communication in all its many forms through events, writing awards, professional development grants, a mentorship program, and an annual holiday party and member meeting that's always a lot of fun. Membership is just $30 a year, $20 for students, and we currently have a $1 hardship membership option for those who are affected by this economic upheaval this year. You can join, sign up for our newsletter, or check out our event calendar at nwscience.org. On Facebook, you can find us at NWScience, and on Twitter, our handle is NSWA. So now I have the great pleasure of turning things over to our featured speakers for the evening, who will introduce themselves, Emily Gilpin and Kara Mckenna. Emily?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm just going to open up my presentation. All right, so I'm joining you tonight from the traditional territories of the Saanich or Wasanich peoples. I'm here currently in my sister's house. I'm 3 weeks back from Brazil, where I was living for the last year. I was living in Bahia in the northeast of Brazil. And I'm back, I'm visiting my sister's home as I find my own place, but I'm very grateful. This photo here was actually taken yesterday on my birthday. I got out on the waters, so I just want to express my gratitude to the ancestors of these lands, the communities here. I'm a grateful visitor, and as a Michif nomad, I identify as a Michif nomad because that's who I am. I've learned how to be a visitor, you know, and that changes a lot depending on where you are and who you're visiting. But that's one of the teachings that I've carried throughout my life. So who am I? I'm Emily. I'm Cree, Métis, Scottish, Irish, and Filipina. This is my grandmother here, this photo, Irene Chartrand. She was born and raised in the Opaskwack Cree territories. And here was in about 1954, where she had a brief stint as a radio DJ up in Churchill, Manitoba. And 1954 wasn't really a time in the area that she was for women to have a really strong voice. So she did anyways. She kind of paved her own way. She was always making people laugh. She was always inappropriate, always throughout our lives. She was, you know, doing what, kind of carving her own way. And so I feel like I take after her a lot. And I truly do believe in a real sense of the word that I have her spirit, and I have the spirit of the Cree women that I come from, and all of my ancestors in me. And I know this 7 generations revitalization to be true in my own life. So I'm grateful to continue this tradition of storytelling and to continuously learn how to do that in a good way. For the last 3 years, I've been reporting on Indigenous-led conservation. So it's through National Observer, now known as Canada's National Observer's First Nations Forward series. I spent the first 2 years as a lead reporter, traveling to different communities across so-called BC. And this last year, I took on the role as managing director. So even though I was living in Brazil, I continued to manage this series and help other reporters continue writing and doing interviews. And I actually launched a First Nations Forward Facebook series, which of course can be found on Facebook, where throughout this entire COVID-19 world health pandemic, I listened to and spoke with Indigenous leaders and community members. But these are just some snapshots of some of the examples of some of the stories that I've had the opportunity to cover over the last couple of years. So as you can see, a lot of the themes are around clean energy, self-determination, stories of success. And, you know, of course, we're going to get into it a little bit more in terms of methodology, but it's really important to me in my work, and I've been taught and led in this way, to share stories of Indigenous peoples in a way that doesn't other, mystify, exotify, share deficit-based or victim-based stories. So I always try and share stories of strength and success in a way that feels authentic and true. And you know, that we really have that responsibility, any of us who are, whether we're Indigenous or not, as we are writing on in stories that impact Indigenous peoples or about Indigenous peoples, to not cause further harm. Because the history of, I'm sure, science journalism specifically, but journalism in general in Canada, has been very colonial. Newspapers were used as an arm of the state, you know, over the last 100 years. And, you know, they were used to write a narrative about peoples who were inferior, you know, conceptions of being uncivilized or savage, a little bit later of being drunk, dancing, or, you know, exotified in a way. And so we need to be very conscious and mindful to not repeat these narratives sometimes, which are so deeply embedded in our subconscious, but which continue to impact our societies in a very real way. So these are just some of the photos that I've taken. As I go through the photos, I'll try and share some examples of what I mean. I don't want us to stay in this realm of theory. I really want us to try and unpack some of the practical things that we can do as writers. This was an example where Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, as Chief Joe Alphonse calls him, Canada's chief, I mean, he went and visited Chilcotin or Tethcotin title land and apologized to the nation on behalf of Canada for the wrongful beheading of 6 war chiefs. And, you know, this was a story where I got a lot of really great photos because I was right up there. But when it came time to putting the story together, I intentionally didn't center Canada's chief in the story. I got a lot of really good photos of Justin Trudeau being gifted, of him holding babies and talking to community, and that's all fine and great. But it's that remembering that this is Canada's chief and this is not the Tethcotin's chief. So, you know, just having that balance in imagery even can make a big difference. This was also in Tethcotin territories, where I went and visited a lake that was under threat of Taseko mines drilling. So, you know, I engaged in a water ceremony with community. I was brought to the actual lake in question. And so it's really important to, you know, when we hear about sacred sites, when we hear about bodies of water or land masses that have a spiritual and cultural connection and importance and significance to community, that we can visit if we can, that we can really see what's at stake, that we engage in ceremony when necessary, and that we're open to that as well and include those realities in our stories. This was up in Haida Gwaii for the Heiltsuk and Haida Women's Gathering. This is a picture of Heiltsuk women, young women singers. And this is in Cleoquet territory, where there were chiefs from other nations in other parts of the world visiting and learning about the Tribal Parks program in the Cleoquet Nation. And the Tribal Parks program is a great example of Indigenous-led environmental conservation, where Indigenous nations are able to use their own laws, and we're talking about thousands of years old laws, and implement them in a new contemporary way and in a language that Canada can understand. So we hear things like land use plans and reconciliation framework agreements and tribal parks programs or food sovereignty programs, and remembering and also contextualizing in our stories and writing that these are actually millennial old traditions, relationships, laws that are now being revitalized in different creative ways so that we can coexist and work together. This is an example. This was Metlakatla Nation and their shellfish farm. So just some of the trips that I've been on to visit different nations and really see what's going on. Different stories here, food sovereignty, we're looking at this story here with the Health-Sick suing Canada. And, you know, they formed a committee themselves and they wrote a report. So really in that story, centering that nation-led report as well as being the expertise in the story. So looking at what research community offers rather than having to contextualize our stories by using an outsider or a white or colonial researcher to give something credit, but really allowing, and this is a form of Indigenous research methodologies, allowing communities to be the experts on their own experiences and stories. This is another photo from that same event where Justin Trudeau and Carolyn Bennett are being smudged off before they give speeches. Kyle Powys-White is an Indigenous scientist and climate expert, and he's a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation in Oklahoma. And he's someone, I had an interview with him last year, 2 years ago perhaps, and it really moved me. It was about a paper that he was writing about how environmentalists and climate experts, one of the big mistakes that they do, which actually causes a lot of harm for Indigenous peoples, is this crisis approach. This idea that we're in a climate crisis and we need to rush to find solutions, and how that actually doesn't leave room for us to build ethical and reciprocal relationships that are needed to actually find solutions. So when we look at non-human relatives and how they are able to migrate or hunt or do what they need to do to adapt to the natural environment or, you know, to the changes that they face, there's a certain type of cohesion that is needed. And as humans, we need a certain type of societal, social cohesion as well in order to come up with the solutions that we need and actually implement them. But acting out of a state of crisis, out of a state of emergency and fear as well, doesn't allow us always to implement those solutions. So I was really moved by that. And I think it's important for us to think about that in our work as well. If we are rushing around, if we are perpetuating that fear-based, that emergency crisis-based narrative as well, and how that might impact, I don't ever say vulnerable peoples, but perhaps overexploited communities or communities whose bodies are on the front lines of a lot of environmental issues that are happening as well. So here's a quote by Kyle. When people feel something is really urgent or crisis-oriented, they tend to forget about their relationships with others. In fact, most phases of colonialism are ones where the colonizing society is freaked out about a crisis. And he continues, like when the hydropower in the US was put in the 30s, 40s, and 50s because of the threat from the Soviet Union, which displaced Indigenous peoples due to the reservoirs from the dam. He also says climate justice is about whether the relationships within a society and across society are compatible and are based on ethical values of norms that will allow for the type of coordination that we need to respond. And finally, why do environmentalists stand side by side with Indigenous peoples against certain projects where interests are aligned, but not to fight for treaty rights or against sexual violence or efforts towards self-determination? So I thought that was a really good point as well. Why do we bring Indigenous peoples in, especially in this realm of climate justice or environmentalism, only when it comes to extractive projects, but not talk about all of the other issues that Indigenous peoples face that need to be addressed as well for true environmental justice? Just some photos from different community visits. A big part of my work is relationship-based reporting, I call it. So I also have been giving workshops on decolonizing or indigenizing journalism. Of course, decolonizing is a controversial topic because in some ways it does center a colonial narrative. It's almost like we just need to decolonize and we go back in a way. And we need to be so careful about the way that we impact our minds, right? We have so many messages that are coming at us all the time. And it's hard to know what is colonial messages that we're receiving and what are not, and how do we differentiate and how do we stay safe and what does that all look like? But instead, we can also think about indigenizing or revitalizing I like to think about it as taking an anti-oppressive approach to storytelling. And so I talk a lot about relationship-based reporting, which sounds just as it is. It's building relationships. It's taking the time really to hear people. It's not rushing. It's being accountable to those relationships. So not taking a story, extracting a story, and never going back, right? So we are taught in our different cultures or from different teachings how to respect ethical, reciprocal, and just relationships in our work. And so as journalists and as writers, we really need to question this idea of objectivity, because objectivity comes from a Western understanding that you can kind of have this view from nowhere. And a journalist that I really respect, Candace Callison, she talks a lot about objectivity, you know, kind of questions this idea of this view from nowhere, because we all have a view from somewhere. We are all educated in different ways. We come from different cultural realities, different families. So we will bring all of those biases and ideas and judgments into our work no matter what. So we need to be aware of that. Like I mentioned, I've been living in the so-called global South for the last year. I was in Brazil for most of it, Peru for a couple months. So I have done some reporting on communities, especially Indigenous communities in the South as well. When I was there, when COVID broke out, I had an opportunity to interview different Indigenous leaders and hear about how Indigenous peoples have been saying, you know, what COVID is telling the world for thousands of years. And there are so many similar messages that you hear from communities across the world, Indigenous communities who are defending their lands and territories. I'm not sure if you know this fact, but Indigenous peoples make up less than 5% of the world's population and protect more than 80% of the world's biodiversity. And to me, that's just astounding. I think that's something that should be on buses and billboards. I think that's something we need to meditate on to really understand and think about that. But when we protect Indigenous peoples and their rights, we protect the environment. So what does that mean? How are we charged with a new responsibility in our work? What stories do we need to make room for? Those are questions that I urge all of us to ask as we move forward. And then of course I reported on, with this last article here, how Indigenous communities have been hit in some ways the hardest than other communities in Brazil. And that's due to a variety of factors, but in many ways, it's like I mentioned, communities are over-targeted and over-exploited. Right now, Brazil has a far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro has threatened a lot of Indigenous rights. He has really deeply affected the demarcation of Indigenous lands, which is legally marking and recognizing Indigenous territories and everyone and everything that's included in that. He has really weakened environmental laws and publicly supported agribusiness and further extractive projects that deeply impact Indigenous peoples. So some effective tools that we can use in our work to decolonize: educate and unlearn. So take anti-oppression, anti-racism, anti-sexism workshops, read Black, Indigenous, and people of color authors, consume decolonial ideologies, right? Avoid the victim narrative, avoid using terms like vulnerable communities. I don't use terms like first world or third world, as I think that it perpetuates a hierarchy and an inferiority complex from the so-called global South to the North. Question phrases like Indigenous peoples are X times more likely to. You know, that's something we really need to sit with as well. When you say Indigenous peoples are X times more likely to have this health issue or be in this situation, we might want to challenge that and put the emphasis back on the oppressor or the state or the government or the institutional barriers that are impacting communities. And so we really need to question the ways that we're perpetuating that victim narrative and that deficit-based narrative, because when we live in a country that still deals with a lot of racism and injustice, we need to be very cautious of the ways that we are perpetuating that and perhaps causing more harm. As mentioned before, building and honoring relationships. Don't treat Indigenous voices as a footnote or a periphery or a check off the checkbox. Take the time needed. Uplift Indigenous experts, reports, and community and committees. Quote Indigenous researchers, implement Indigenous research methodologies, decentralize Western science and so-called experts, and lift up Indigenous voices and worldviews. So sometimes we might want to look back at what we write and question whether or not we are centralizing a colonial law, a colonial worldview, and then treating Indigenous worldviews as this kind of token periphery, or as this romanticized, and then there are people who think this about the land, or who think this about the waters, or who think this about whale populations, and really questioning that and making room and legitimizing Indigenous worldviews as well, treating them as equal to colonial worldviews, if not much older. So here, this is a piece by a friend, Joshua Powis-Steckley, that kind of represents natural law. And, you know, I just want to finish off this presentation. I wish I could share more, but I do want to finish off this presentation with a little quote. I'm quoting myself, which is kind of weird, but it's just a way for me to round up these thoughts. This is going to be shared in the op-ed, the last op-ed that I am writing for National Observer for now, because next week I take on a new role as managing director of Indigenews. It's a new news organization, Indigenous-led news organization, independent Indigenous media by Discourse and APTN. So I'm excited for that, but let me just read to you a little bit of what I wrote here. Indigenous people make up less than 5% of the world's population and protect more than 80% of the world's biodiversity. I do not believe the burden to save the planet rests with Indigenous people. I believe the future of our life on the planet rests with ancient law. Indigenous peoples in colonial countries continue to fight to survive, to push back against systems built to eradicate or assimilate. And yet, despite the ongoing and intergenerational impacts of colonization, Indigenous peoples are on the front lines of environmental protection movements. Their bodies often the only forces protecting the ecosystems that we all depend on. What I mean to say is that there are people who are in conversation with the worlds beyond the world of appearances, and who are better positioned to bring us all back if we want to continue to be a part of this life on Earth. There are people who know why their ancestors did what they did, when and why they hunted or harvested, why they conducted ceremony in the way they did. There are people whose calendars reflect the natural cycles of life, the seasons. There are people who understand what it is to leave a place better than when you found it, whose respect for reciprocity is as instinctual as a salmon that returns to its spawning grounds to die. There are people whose internal technologies are more advanced than our artificial technologies, people who navigate endless bodies of water with their senses, who see the silver or lightning of spirit and feel the memory of place. There are people who let the spirit of the day in when they open the door in the morning, before they step outside, and people who pour some out or lay a plate before they drink or eat. There are people who have been taught how to do the work, to let spirit speak through, to incorporate the supernatural, orishas or ancestors. There are people who ask permission before they traverse bodies of water or harvest medicines, people who drop prayer-infused tobacco before they build a home, and people who recognize themselves and others in their everyday greetings. There are people who know how many fish to pull from the river, when to give back, or when to not go out at all. People building energy solutions that flow with cycles of nature rather than seek to destroy them. The point is, we have nothing to lose and everything to learn from the natural world and those who know her oldest stories and laws, and those who embody them in their everyday life. So I'm going to finish there because I think I've reached my 15 minutes, but I'm looking forward to chatting more in our question and answer period. So thank you so much for all of you for joining. Just to kind of round up, you know, if that was confusing for anyone, I'm really on this point that what we need is, we need to go back to natural law, and natural law are laws that have existed for thousands of years. Natural laws are evident in many of the oldest and most ancient societies. Indigeneity is a complex topic that includes Afro-Indigeneity, Asian indigeneity, people living land-based traditions, millennial-old traditions. And in some ways, if we really want to talk about environmental justice, if we really want to continue to see our life flourish on the planet, I think we need to go back to those laws in many ways, and to do that, perhaps uplifting the people who still practice those laws, who still know those stories, and who live lives and embody teachings that really will bring us back to a sense of balance with all of our non-human relatives as well. So thank you so much for your time. Hi, and I look forward to hearing more from all of you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Emily. I always love just hearing what you have to say. Emily is just so brilliant at putting words to these concepts and practices that we utilize in Indigenous media. And I feel like we can all learn a lot from her, so that's great. So I'm Kara Mckenna, and I am here on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory, also known as East Vancouver. I'm Alberta Métis on my mom's side, also with roots in the Michelle First Nation. I'm a descendant of Louis Calahoo, and my ancestry on my dad's side is Irish. I recently learned that my last name, Mckenna, in Gaelic loosely translates to a devotee of the pagan fire god, and I was pretty excited to learn that. It's super heavy metal. I was thinking about just how to introduce this talk, just essentially about decolonizing the way we write about science and Indigenous communities in general. And like Emily, I had a lot to say. I don't consider myself to be a public speaker at all, but just going through my presentation today, I was realizing that it was like almost an hour long and I had to cut a lot of it out. But hopefully there will be something that you can take away from what I'm going to talk about. I just want to start out by saying that I obviously don't consider my perspective to be the be-all end-all in Indigenous reporting. I'm just sharing my personal experiences that I've had through my 8+ year long reporting career. I've gone back and forth between Indigenous media and mainstream media, so it's been pretty interesting. A few of the places I've worked are the Canadian Press, the Nanaimo Daily News, APTN National News, and most recently I was the editor of the Salish Sea Sentinel magazine, which I did for 3 years and covered Coast Salish communities around Vancouver Island, the Lower Mainland, and into Washington State. Currently, I'm a part-time editor at Indigenews, and I'm a freelance journalist and studying creative writing at the University of British Columbia. So these are some photos that I've taken from around BC over the past couple of years, and I just wanted to share those just really quick. The top left is in Klahoose territory on Cortez Island. Below that is a woman from Squamish Nation doing a cedar brushing of a canoe that was built at Capilano University. In the center, this was a water blessing ceremony in Tsleil-Waututh territory at Weyahwitchin in North Vancouver. On the right, that's Gary, who's a canoe builder at Howalt Nation. A little bit of a weaving by Angela George in there. And then this was from Vancouver Indigenous Fashion Week. I love that Emily shared a picture of her grandma because I also included a picture. This is actually a photo of my great-grandmother. And it's not as high quality as the last photos because I just snapped it with my phone at my grandmother's house. But this is my great-grandma, Mary Jordan Belcourt. And I just wanted to show you a picture of her because she was a medicine woman. She really was an expert in plants and her territory. This is her at her house outside of Hinton, Alberta. But she really just knew the ins and outs of her territory and had so much plant knowledge. And I would just really consider her to be like a scientist, even though she didn't go to school for that. And this is just something that rings so true to so many Indigenous communities and these knowledge keepers that hold all this scientific knowledge. You know, like Western science has so much knowledge, but we also need to be acknowledging the ways in which elders and knowledge keepers have knowledge that's been passed down to them over many generations and thousands of years. And I thought this was a kind of cool example of that. This is a story I did a couple of years ago for the Salish Sea Sentinel about the late Chief Adam Dick, who's Kupakuak. He is the keeper, was the keeper of thousands of traditional songs, and he had been working with scientists, Western scientists, for the later part of his life, just passing down this knowledge he had about songs because they hold so much knowledge about the land. And one example he shared was just songs about clam gardens in the territory. And they learned a lot just from talking to him, and this is something that translates apparently around the world. So I thought that was pretty neat. And just talking about science journalism, you know, I was thinking about my experience just reporting in that area. And one of the first things you learn in journalism is never to send your stories to sources before they're published. And there's good reasons for that. But when I started at Canadian Press, they had an exception to that rule, and it was that you can send stories to your sources before they're published as long as they're scientists and you're writing a science story. And the reason for that was because they didn't want to be inaccurate about all this complex information in reports, in studies. It's really easy to misinterpret something when you're talking to a scientist and you just get a short interview with them and you're writing about it. And so we didn't want to misrepresent that information. And I like to push back on that, which seems to be a little bit controversial for some. But as well as sending stories to scientists, I will send them to elders and knowledge keepers as well before I publish them. Wanted to share this example at Tla'amin Nation. So I was asked by an elder and some other people at Tla'amin to cover this ceremony. I think it was 2 years ago. And they were holding a ceremony for residential school survivors of the Sea Shelter Residential School and all the children that didn't make it back to Tla'amin.
Maybe while we wait for Kara to rejoin, Emily, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely. And I also just wanted to mention, I shared a couple of resources here. So one, the first link is on decolonizing methodologies. That's from a Maori scholar. The second one is a book by Candace Callison and Mary Lynn Young, Reckoning, talking about journalism limits and possibilities. And the third is Seeing Red. So it covers the history of newspapers in Canada, understanding how newspapers come from a colonial background. So just to let people know, those links are available there in the chat box.
Wonderful. That's great. Yeah, the question I wanted to ask is about Indigenous. Since both of you will be working on that and picking up on something that Kara just mentioned, I'm wondering how, since you are managing director, you have the chance to shape the editorial processes that you will use in reporting and in publishing. And I'm wondering whether you're already planning to do some things differently from what's done in sort of mainstream Canadian and American press.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really awesome because we have this big team of Indigenous reporters and there's a whole bunch of Indigenous peoples involved on all ends. So I think naturally it will just be different. There'll be a lot of relationships involved. You know, there will be a lot of understanding of certain histories or backdrops, but I know that we're really pushing for a lot of visual content as well. And I think that's the way that journalism is metamorphosizing. That's the way that I see it. I think we want to see more videos and photos, and of course we want to read good human-centered stories as well. But I think we need to be, I always say that we need to have the highest quality of stories, photos, and videos, because we have so much harm to push back against. There's still so much racism in so-called North America that we need to understand still exists. So we need to be very careful about the images that we put out there. We need to be very careful on how we're fact checking. So it's almost like the bar is just raised super high. You know, we can't be rushing around. We can't be making small mistakes because, you know, if there's still people fighting for their lives in Canada, you know, we see a lot of horrible stories coming out all the time about racism in medical institutions, or education institutions, or people being misnamed or misplaced. And so we just want to make sure that we're fact checking really hard, that we're having the highest quality imagery that we can have. And then of course that we're continuing to honor and uphold the relationships involved in the people whose stories we have the honor to share.
So to get more specific on that,
Yep.
Kara mentioned this practice that some of us do follow in science journalism, but only for certain publications, of sharing drafts with our sources if we're not sure that we have fully grasped the complexity of what we're covering. It is a practice that some science journalists do, certainly. And I'm wondering if that will be part of your standard practice at Indigenews or not, or especially when you get into controversial topics, which I'm sure there are many that you will cover, how you handle those situations.
I think it's going to be context by context. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. I mean, I've shared quite a few drafts, to be totally honest. I call it a culture check, because even me being a Cree Métis person, if I'm interviewing a Heiltsuk elder or a Haida elder or, you know, a Tsimshian community member, I don't come from those places. I don't have those teachings. So I could have missed or misunderstood something, and I don't want to misrepresent. So that doesn't, of course, mean that you're sharing a Word doc that has editing, you know, abilities, but you might want to check in on a paragraph or two. You might want to check in on a specific example, or especially an oral story, and just make sure that you heard it right. You might want to have a phone call and read it out loud or just discuss, but that really relies on that ongoing relationship, right? That open communication, not just doing interviews, extracting, leaving, and then having that person see the article come out, you know, when everybody else does, and then you have room for a lot of mistakes, and, you know, how do you move forward from there? So that's been my practice personally, and there's been times I've had to have conversations with editors around what that would be like, what that looks like, and I think those conversations will continue with Indigenews, but I know there is a lot of respect for getting it right and making sure that we are representing peoples and what they share appropriately. So I think that will be context by context. I know professionally, the standard is to follow the general journalistic standard and not to share your drafts. But of course, you know, as stories come up, or perhaps if community members or interviewees request that, then perhaps there will be some room.
So yeah, sorry, I'm a slide ahead, but I'll just continue what I was saying before. I was talking about that story at Tla'amin. So it was a healing ceremony for survivors of residential school and the children who never made it home. And we ended up creating this story that was quite short, but we spent like 2 days covering it. And my point was we were asked, pardon me, we were asked to be covered this story by one of the elders. And at the end, I had sent it to him so we could fact check it. And it was basically all correct, but there was a subtle change in wording that seemed like something small when he was talking about it, but was actually a big deal just based on his teachings and the ceremony. And so I was able to make a change in that piece, and they had their accurate depiction of history as they wanted, and it made the story much more accurate for the community. So it's just really important to acknowledge this history and this worldview. It's such a key part of indigenizing the way we cover stories, science stories, because as Emily was saying, everything is holistic. And I think one of the biggest things I've learned just reporting on science is that it often means acknowledging the history from the jump, acknowledging that Indigenous worldview and taking the time and patience, allowing Indigenous voices to lead stories. And at times it can be complex and it's difficult because there's no set rules. You're just kind of learning as you go, and it depends based on where you are. And so you're kind of just blazing these trails and rewriting the rules. And so that can be a little bit scary and interesting when you're actually reporting in the communities. So just a couple of final things. I won't take too much longer since I had that huge delay, and I want you guys to be able to ask questions. But I just wanted to quickly share this recent story I did with The Guardian, which was pretty neat to have that opportunity. And the thing that I thought was especially cool about it was just being able to report this story for an international news outlet from an Indigenous worldview, and having that be seen like as an asset rather than as something unbiased or whatever else. I spent a lot of time writing about orca stories in the past in Coast Salish communities, and I did this whole issue of the Salish Sea Sentinel around orca culture and listening to hours and hours of testimony from the National Energy Board about orcas in terms of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. And I feel like just having that context, even through these stories that some might feel are like small stories, is so helpful, and you garner so much just by meeting with community members and speaking with people and making these contacts and being patient and communicating. And it was actually such an asset for me when I was reporting for The Guardian, because I was able to talk about, you know, like the Lummi word for orca means our relatives who live under the sea. And I was able to kind of make that parallel, as one of the women said, to Indian boarding schools and like children getting taken away. And the story was about an orca getting taken away. And so, you know, even the significance of the ceremony, they dropped a cedar wreath in the ocean, and, you know, just knowing all this context was so helpful, because it's not usually context you can just research through Google or whatever else. Like, you have to know it by talking to people and listening. Another cool example of that was this story at Sauk Nation. That's my old boss at the Salish Sea Sentinel. He used to be the editor. He took me to see these wasabi greenhouses, and I ended up pitching the story to the Globe and Mail because I thought it was so cool. They have these massive wasabi greenhouses at Sauk, and it's part of this green initiative where most of the nation is run on solar power, and they're environmental leaders. And so it was neat. I just asked my boss, like, can I pitch this to the Globe and Mail? It's such a big story. And they really liked that. It was on the front of the BC section. So that was pretty neat. And then, yeah, I'll just leave you. I'll leave you guys, especially now with my email and my Twitter. Please reach out if you want to have these conversations and continue them.
Terrific. Thank you, Kara. Well, we do have several questions, and attendees, go ahead and send us more if you like. Here's one from Aaron Ross, one of our board members, asking, Kara, how have editors of mainstream publications responded when you tell them that you'll be sending stories back to your Indigenous sources? Do you have any tips for those of us who would like to do the same, but might, you know, encounter resistance to that?
It's funny because I've been in Indigenous media for so long, and I haven't really been bold enough to do it until I worked in Indigenous media. And I know that I'm not really saying you have to do it either. And I think there's different ways you can do it. Like, you don't have to send your full story to someone. You can just phone them and fact check, or all these ways that we practice in normal journalism, like send them the section that they're in. I did once send a full story to a source when I was working at Nanaimo Daily News without telling my editor, but I wouldn't advise that necessarily. It's just a case-by-case sort of thing, in my opinion.
Great. Let's see, here's one. Maybe Emily, you want to field this one from Hakai? I think you read it already.
I did read it. Yeah, I think it's a good question. There are many different ways to tell stories. Why launch yourself into journalism, a precarious career? I've been asked that question many times. Like, why are you joining journalism? It's dying. And it's not. It's being reborn. I feel like we're in a state of metamorphosis. And if we really question what is journalism, journalism's new, storytelling's old, right? So it's shifting shape, of course. But, you know, Indigenous communities, storytelling is huge in many different Indigenous communities across the world, right? I've heard stories about people, scouts, bringing news from one community to another. Storytelling is a form of oral tradition. It can be a form of, you know, witnessing and hearing people's, you know, migration stories, origin stories, who has hereditary rights to what territories. So it's a way of actually managing land as well. So storytelling is ancient. And it's a practice, like I said, I feel, you know, with Kara, the same perhaps, but it's something that I feel is a sacred responsibility. It's something that I feel is my calling and, you know, responsibility as a Michif person, especially, to walk between worlds, to try and shape shift and code switch and find a way that we can understand our languages and cosmologies, though they may differ in different ways. But I think that, you know, I don't think of journalism perhaps in the way that it's shown in the media. That's not the way that I think about my job. So I think that there is room for us to continue to tell stories in creative ways, and we can call it journalism, and that's great too. But news sharing, storytelling, these are ancient traditions that will just continue to shift shape. So that's more what I feel like we're a part of.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I just want to add, because a lot of the storytelling traditions in nations are oral storytelling traditions. And I've had some interesting overlaps with that. Another example from Tla'amin is I should say, to start, a lot of Coast Salish nations have witnessing ceremonies when they hold an important event. So they'll call on witnesses, and they're given this great responsibility, which is to remember the event and pass down what they learned through future generations and make sure that information is shared. And there was one event that I was covering for the Salish Sea Sentinel, and I got called as a witness. And I was just thinking about that responsibility in terms of journalism, because it's like, is that not what we're doing all the time? Is like sharing this information, and that's a sacred responsibility to make sure that what you're sharing is accurate and that it's recorded history, and you're writing it down so that people can reference it, and it'll get referenced for generations. Like, you see how media is referenced all the time in the court, in all these places. And so it's such a big responsibility, and I definitely agree with what Emily said as well.
I wonder if I could follow up then on that question about how we who are not Indigenous introduce ourselves as journalists to when we want to cover a story that involves First Nations peoples or lands. What is the perception of what we do in journalism, in mainstream journalism, among Indigenous people? It is how much are they consumers of journalism? To what extent do they trust or distrust it? Is there a difficulty, or is there a particular way in which we can introduce ourselves that is more respectful or be better received?
I think it just takes time. Personally, I've had really wildly different experiences based on where I'm reporting from. Working for Canadian Press or the Nanaimo Daily News especially was known to have a very conservative, racist editor. And so it was really difficult to navigate being a reporter in that environment, wanting to tell Indigenous stories. And with APTN, I would be standing there with an APTN camera and microphone, and people would just come up and grab the microphone and start telling the craziest stories. And so I think there is a lot of mistrust around the mainstream media, but I think it just takes time. It takes time to build these relationships and build trust, and you can't force your way in. And I even think, like, if you're not from the community, like, no matter who you are, it takes time to build those relationships and show that you can do the job. And some of the communities I've been covering since like 2012. So it's taken me this amount of time to get them to contact me and send me stories and have me at events. And so I think it's just a time thing and a patience thing.
Another thing I would say is intention. I've been taught the importance of intention in many different spaces. Before a fast, before a sweat, before many different ceremonies, intention comes up quite often. What is your intention? And so I think that can be used in our work as well. I think we need to ask ourselves our intention all the time and sit with that question personally. What is your intention with writing the story? If your intention is to win a Pulitzer Prize, I wouldn't be surprised if there are bumps along the way, if there are perhaps relationships that get mislooked along the way. If your intention is to be honest, to tell a story, or to hear a community, that will change as well. So if you have spent that time questioning your intention, if you've asked your editors in the newsroom the intention of seeking that story, and then you can honestly present yourself to community, this is who I am, and this is my intention of coming here to be a vehicle for your voice, or to hold out my microphone, or to use my pen, or to use the space that I take up, or to use my gift of writing and the resources I may have to get out your story, then I think that also helps with building those relationships and building that trust. But the thing is, a lot of the time, we're not asking ourselves what our intention is. I've worked for different newsrooms or different editors who I don't actually align with the intention. I didn't quite agree with the intention. I felt like the intention was to exotify, or for poverty porn, or for likes. I'm not going to write a story just for clickbait, right? Because that has a potential to cause more harm. So I think if we really center intention in our work, that can make a big difference.
Also related to this thread, Carol asks about different storytelling structures, which she understands some Indigenous storytelling structures are very different from those in the Western Press and ask whether you're going to be experimenting or have been. It sounds like you have been already with Indigenous ways of telling stories. And maybe you could give some examples of specifics that would help us understand that.
Well, I can say personally, I've had some interesting conversations around this, just editing the Salish Sea Sentinel. I would often work with people from Indigenous communities that weren't journalists, but they were storytellers and they were great oral storytellers. And I would recruit them to write pieces for the Sentinel. And just working with them was super interesting because they're oral storytellers often. And so I found that most of the time when they would file a piece, the lead was at like the very bottom because the way you tell a story orally is so different than the way you write a story. And so often all I would have to do is just take the last few lines and like move them to the top. And then it was an amazing print story. So that's kind of my experience dealing with that.
Yeah, that's such a good question because it's very true. I mean, I wasn't raised in, like a Cree Métis cultural context necessarily, like strictly in terms of storytelling. So I don't have those teachings. It's been an ongoing learning process, but I've definitely been able to bear witness to many different forms of storytelling from different communities, from Kanaka Maoli people in Hawaii, to, elders in different communities where perhaps there is no moral of the story. I have a good friend, Jesquan Bedard, who's Haida, and she says, our stories don't have one moral. Like that's a very Western way of storytelling. You finish a story and it's like, the moral is, she's like, no, there are lessons throughout. There are, trickster stories throughout. There are so much to take from it. I've heard storytellers from different communities tell stories that kind of take you on a ride, loop you around, things come up, or that just drop pieces of knowledge that you don't really understand until maybe even days, months, years later. So I think there is a lot for us to learn. And I think there are really great storytellers out there who perhaps are more fluent in their storytelling traditions. So I wonder how we might be a vehicle for those stories as well, right? How we might hold out the mic or just be able to take up this space in a creative way so that folks can tell their own stories.
Yeah, I often find when I'm listening to elders, I'll listen to them while recording it, and then listening to the recording later, it's like there's so much more to take away every time you hear it. And I'm so fascinated with that kind of storytelling, and I'd love to be able to reproduce it, but like I'm not a trained oral historian or anything. So all we can do is just try to like share other people's voices and amplify them.
Great. Lisa Hayward asks what training each of you have had, both formally and informally.
Tricky, right? What's formal, what's informal? But I have an undergraduate degree in philosophy. And then after that, I did a graduate program at Concordia University in journalism. And it was actually in that program where I was like, holy shit balls, we're being taught some real colonial ways of doing things. Like this is going to cause a lot of harm, already has caused a lot of harm. And I kind of went underground and started giving workshops on decolonizing, reaching out to community, looking to my own teachings and relationships and, knowledge of, what has been done wrong and what could be done differently, trying to see if there were conversations happening across the country. And there were only a few programs where there was a chance for journalists to learn that there might be a different ethical practice that we can really look to and that we might be able to indigenize media and communication. So I was told I would never get a job. And then out of that graduate program, I was the only one who got a job. I got an internship through Journalists for Human Rights. And that brought me to the West Coast, where I interned with the Tyee before joining the National Observer. And then I worked as the lead reporter for National Observer for 2 years and then managing director, and I'm about to go on with Indigenews. And informal, I mean, my whole life, relationships, family, teachings that are spoken or unspoken, ancestors, spiritual guides, ceremonies. So all of that shapes who I am and my work as well.
Yeah, and I went to journalism school at Langara College. I have a diploma in journalism. I'm only just finishing my bachelor's degree right now at UBC. It took me a long time to go back and finish it, but I could say so much about the education that I've experienced in newsrooms, just learning from mentors that I've had, but particularly going into Indigenous communities and making these connections over many years. Like it's hard to even describe the amount that I've learned from other people. And, you know, in Indigenous media, the way we cover stories is so much different than mainstream media in just the way that we take the time. Like the one story I was showing you guys before I got abruptly cut off rudely by my computer. You could see it was like a little more than half a page of writing, but that story took 2 days of reporting where I spent probably like 10 hours in the longhouse sitting through a ceremony. And then my coworker, Todd, went to Tla'amin the next day and spent another like 6 hours sitting through a ceremony. And so it can be frustrating because it's like, oh, all this time and then a short story, but you learn so much through that process. And yeah, it's hard to even put into words, but I've learned so much. I'm so grateful for all the people that I've worked with and that have talked to me, and I almost feel like I should be paying them and doing something for them in just the way that they've taught me so much about journalism.
Okay. Here's a question from Hannah that I think a lot of us would like to know an answer to, because it's come up a lot with our pandemic reporting, just avoiding the saying Indigenous people are X times more likely or at a greater risk from COVID, for example, as a phrase to avoid. So how would you recommend, reframing that in a way that doesn't put the onus?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we need to, maybe sit with is just kind of what is that sentence, what's the impact of that phrase, on our subconscious, as a nation, as a community, as a person. And for me, despite who I am and my relationships, when I hear that, it creates another idea that, oh, Indigenous peoples are victims, are vulnerable, are dealing with all of these issues, which may be true, but where is the culprit? Like, why are we not talking about the actual force of oppression or the reason why this is happening? So I think we just maybe need to question, perhaps rather than sharing that, we can shift the gaze and talk about what are the institutional barriers. What is the government or state's relationship? What's the historical context here? Why does this situation exist? Rather than just throwing it out there and saying, I'm not accountable to that, we need to contextualize it. We need to explain, what that means. Maybe the Canadian government is X times more likely to withhold funds from, do this too, so shifting that and talking about all of the other reasons why this, scenario exists. I think that's a really important thing, because we just take these things for granted. We're so used to seeing them in papers that we just don't really think too much about it. But I do think we need to ask ourselves, what's the impact of this sentence? Am I including all relative parties here? Or should I really talk about, like I said, institutional barriers, the government or state relationship, the historical context, and any other kinds of relative facts, right? Because our job as journalists is to tell the truth and to be accurate. So sometimes we need to really question, what is the full truth here? What does it mean to be accurate here?
Yeah, 100%. And I feel that for so long, people saying that being unbiased, you're only showing the colonial perspective of but in fact, we also need to show this history that we weren't really taught in schools, and go back when we're talking about disproportionate rates of whatever, of addiction or whatever we're talking about, go back to why, what is the reason for that, and show that history and that worldview. It's so key.
Great. Okay, here's an anonymously posted question. It's a loaded one. Let's see. How can those of us working in conservation have culturally sensitive discussions about issues related to things like rhino horns, tiger parts, turtle smuggling, and other wildlife trafficking issues, which are very steeped in culture, but also are not scientific and are hurting species survival? It is kind of a loaded question. So, either of you care to tackle that?
Kara, any thoughts?
I'm just thinking about it. I feel like I'm sorry, I feel like I'm not informed enough on those types of things. I haven't really reported much on any of those issues, and so I don't feel too comfortable commenting on that in particular. Trying to think of something I could say.
Yeah, what comes to mind, something that I might, maybe a connection, maybe it's too big of a jump, but when we're talking about working in conservation, right? And so, there's a lot of environmental pushback against seal hunting, for example, or, other Indigenous traditions, perhaps, Not saying that any of these things, like Kara mentioned, I'm less familiar with these, you know, what cultural context we're speaking about, what region in the world, that sort of thing. But I think, again, contextualize, talk about the history of the region, not just the recent history, but, you know, what the last 1,000 years, 100 years, you know, how can we understand this activity? What is the cultural context? What parties are at play here? Like really painting that big picture rather than just simplifying any kind of activity like this, which clearly has big consequences for the environment, for non-human relatives, and for the communities who call these places home and perhaps depend on these trades for different economic or societal reasons. Like, I'm sure there's a lot of nuance and gray area that would be worth fleshing out, because of course binaries are a lie, and binaries can be very destructive as well.
Yeah, I just watched Angry Inuk, and it makes me think a little bit about that and the seal hunt, and how Inuit are so painted as villains for hunting seals, though they've been conserving and, you know, maintaining that practice for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
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 Here's an interesting question I was wondering as well, so I'll amplify it. Thank you. And they say, and they're curious who the audience is that you keep in mind when you're writing. Primarily the communities you're writing about, those who need to learn. You try and balance both, since there can be very different communities. How does that show up in your writing?
For me, it kind of depends who I'm writing for. Like when I wrote for the Salish Sea Sentinel, I had a very specific lady in mind, and she's this lady I met at Cahoose Nation who is an elder, and she told me that she saves every issue of the magazine, and like scrapbooks the photos and shares the stories. And I always think about her when I would write stories for the magazine, and just all these people in the communities who are getting it to their homes, who have this inherent understanding of everything that I'm writing about, more so than me. So I would never feel the need to like go into basics. But if I'm writing for like The Guardian, for example, I know someone reading from Europe or something isn't going to know all the ins and outs of like Coast Salish worldview and culture. But yeah, it just depends. I just think about it in terms of who the main audience is for the publication I'm writing for, and go from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's good to contextualize, you know, what is this organization? Who is their audience? But then also what happens sometimes, and there can be a little bit of a dance, you know, working with editors as well, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, but sometimes people might try and change your wording or the tone to make it easier to digest. And sometimes that can cause more harm, right? Because it can really simplify what you're talking about, or it can slip into that exotification or romanticization of people, or even the infantilization that can happen really easily as well. The infantilization of Indigenous peoples is kind of, oh, you know, they love the land and love the trees. And it's like, we're talking about millennial old laws here. You know, we're talking about ancient relationships. And so, you know, I think we have to be careful as well in our tone and what we're talking about. If we're trying to kind of simplify it for a non-Indigenous audience, I think we need to do that in a good way. I think we need to be careful of that. So it's good to keep our audiences in mind, but also, you know, I like I said, I'm a mixed person, right? So I'm trying to talk to everybody, and, you know, I'm trying to talk to, you know, the experts in the story, as well as people who maybe are less familiar, don't have relationships, and just let spirit speak through. Tap Waywin, just let spirit speak through, let the story speak for itself.
Great. Okay, here's a question from Aaron. Both of you have talked about the importance of building relationships and telling Indigenous stories, sometimes over several years. When you were reporting in situations where you might have less time, perhaps when you were telling Indigenous stories in other parts of the world, for example, when you were in Brazil, I understand you were in Peru for a while too, for a few months. How do you go about building those relationships?
I'll jump in there. I mean, I've been taught about reciprocity. So I've been taught that I don't ask someone for something without being able to reciprocate in some way. So for me, being in a new setting, it's really important that I activate that ancient practice of witnessing, right? Bearing witness is present in a lot of different traditions across the world, and it's very fundamental. So the audience is just as important in our stories as the writer, as the stories themselves, because it's that trade-off, right? So I really witness, I really watch. You know, how do others interact with each other? How do people new to the space greet people? Who is the expert in the room, or who is the elder? So I think witnessing and really observing, if we have any kind of time to do that, is really important. Another thing is to bring a gift. If you're showing up to a new community or a new space, bring a gift. You know, what does that look like? It doesn't necessarily need to be a pouch of tobacco if those aren't your teachings. And if that won't mean something to someone, you can explain what that means to you, or the way that you've been taught. But that could also be, you know, a bag of coffee. It could be chocolate. It could be homemade soap. It could be something from the region, you know, that might be nice. It could be fruit for elders, right? It might look differently, but I think showing up with your hands full, showing up to help out as well is great. I've been in spaces where I haven't had a lot of time and people didn't even know I was a journalist at first, because I just showed up and said, you know, can I hold your baby? Can I cut these veggies? Can I do something? Show that you want to be a part of the community and the space. I've had interviews with people when I've been washing their dishes while they're doing something, to show that I'm not expecting them to just give me their time, you know, just because they want the story to be told. We can't expect people to just stop their lives. You know, that's been especially the case with Indigenous women, because Indigenous women are some of the busiest people that I've ever met in my life, right? So I think we just need to watch, see what's culturally appropriate, offer hands, offer presence in a respectful way, listen and witness if we can. That usually goes well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I echo that. And I actually started a couple of years ago. My mom and I were in the Okanagan, and we were harvesting sage nearby where we were camping. And I started just every summer harvesting sage and drying it and making these sage bundles. And I'll bring them to people when I feel like I'm doing a hard interview, or it's someone I just met. But for a long time, just when I've interviewed people and some trauma comes up or something, I've often felt really strange about just leaving. And this is a little bit of a different response to what you were asking, but I felt like it was just wrong to be leaving and kind of extracting and then leaving. And so I found just bringing sage and leaving someone with a bundle of sage that I picked, you know, with my mom and dried myself and bundled myself. It's such a gesture that people appreciate. And, you know, if you're non-Indigenous, you have different teachings that could be anything, but it's just worth considering that, like, what are you taking and what are you giving?
I just want to jump in. Thanks, Kara. I think that's really important. And that's just a reminder that sometimes when we're speaking with folks, we can bring up stories of trauma, right? And so being trauma informed is really important. You know, journalist Angela Starrett just tweeted the other day, you know, journalists need trauma training. And she just repeated that over and over, because it's very true. And another thing too that I find is great is to learn a few words in the language. Learn how to say thank you, learn how to say hello, maybe how to introduce yourself even. And that could also be a big bridge builder as well.
Yeah, it's awkward at first, but
yeah, but the effort is usually appreciated.
Terrific. Okay, and I think we have time for one more question here. It's a little involved. Elizabeth has written it here. Have you had a chance to read it, or maybe you could read it now and comment on this? It has to do with, again, with sort of showing your work in advance to, in this case, to a whole tribal council.
That's happened before quite a few times. I've had stories go through, you know, chief and council. I've had stories go through, you know, different, needs to go from one chief to another, or, you know, check in with this family. And that's not for me to say, right? That's for community to know. They know who needs to see the story, and they'll tell you. I'm curious about the practice and why that was or is important. I wouldn't know for this specific tribal council, this specific person, right? Because that's going to be very contextual depending on the community, depending on the family or the situation that you're working with. But, you know, those who know will know. And so I think it's important as well to ask, hey, is there anyone that needs to see this before it comes out? You know, I had done a story before about a certain nation, and one of the feedback that I got was, hey, you know, this is a nation with a hereditary leadership, and you didn't actually include a hereditary chief's voice in that story, right? So there's some of that as well. It's like, okay, that's interesting, because in journalism school, you don't learn that you need to do that, right? Those are things that are going to come up depending on who you're working with. So just keeping an open mind about that, perhaps asking, you know, should I talk to an elder? Should I speak with a language speaker? Should I speak with a chief? should I, do I only have male voices in? Do I only have female? Is that appropriate? So just really asking that, making room for that as well. And then just letting community lead you along the way.
Yeah, and I think just being patient with yourself as well. Like me and Emily have both been in the industry for a long time, and I think neither of us came into it just knowing everything. Like I know for me, it's been such a journey. And I've made mistakes along the way. And I was going to talk about that in my presentation, but I didn't really have time. But I feel like, like we all make mistakes, and you just have to move forward and continue to try to forge these relationships. And no one does it perfectly. We're all kind of stumbling our way through in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. I would assume apologies, though, when you do make mistakes, apologies are a good practice.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you. And we do, keeping with what you just said, we do have a gift to leave you. I will email you about it later. It's not dried sage. It's not something, but it's something we hope you can use. So thanks again. We really enjoyed and learned a lot from your teachings. We appreciate it, and thank you for your work.
Yeah, thank you, Wade. I really enjoyed connecting with you and this organization, and I love forming these relationships, and I hope that we can continue to talk. I left my email there, but I have my Twitter, it's on there as well. I'd love to continue these conversations with anyone. I know we got cut off, so if you want to just reach out, I'm so happy to chat, and I love doing this. It was super fun.
Excellent.
Yeah, I want to echo that and say thank you for organizing this event and making room for this really important topic. Thank you so much, Kara, for all the work that you do and all the care that you put into it. So I'm looking forward to working with you and everyone in the Indigenous team. And, I think it's just a great reminder. Sometimes these conversations around decolonizing or what does it look like going forward? How do I be a good ally? How do I be a good vehicle? How do I be a good person? Like sometimes they can be really overwhelming. But I think it's really important to remember that there is space for all of us here. All of our voices are important and needed as we move forward. So just encourage everyone to continue with this work and to remember that we're all a part of this collective family. And so I look forward to working with all of you as we move forward in a good way. Hi.
We look forward to reading your work at indigenews.org, I believe, yes?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Have a good
Take
evening.
care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.